ask you if you can just say something in there and just Charlie's piano play. Because I need to make sure.
And Sebastian wants to talk to him. Yeah, just
I'm going to use this one. Something.
Sebastian wants you to talk to him.
So we're just going to do a sound test. Just waiting for candles. Did you want to say anything? Oh, the pointer will do it automatically.
Well, the thing is inside the bed, so you know that. Okay, good.
With all the technology, we're having issues with our candle. Of all things. As they work on that, I'll just welcome you to St. Paul's Wimbledon Parkside Advent talk. This is our fourth in our series, fourth and final talk with the theme of the light of the world. So we're looking forward to a lovely talk this evening with Kevin Jones, our music director. Now, let me just make sure that you can all hear me. I'm not getting a nod from everyone. Are you okay? You need a bit more volume. We might need to put you on the lapel and this, do you think?
Right. I can speak. Can you hear me when I speak at this volume? Yes?
Okay.
Okay, that's all right then.
Whoops.
Okay.
I think we can just
We'll just leave it at
candles, I think. That'll be all right.
Okay. So I'll hand over to Kevin.
Thank you. Well, welcome to this fourth in the series. I'm repeating what Susan has just said, but it's particularly appropriate, I think, to have this particular piece of music in this Christmas or lead up to Christmas season. As you'll see, there are many aspects about the picture which are relevant. If for any reason you can't hear me because I forget and drop my voice, do raise your hand. Okay. This picture, The Light of the World, one of the most famous pictures, I think, in the Western canon, I must confess, what never used to be my favourite picture. I used to think of it as being a sort of bit of wearisome Victorian sentimentality and sort of steered clear of the great enthusiasm that I knew some friends, and church friends particularly, had for this picture. So why did I write a piece of music based on it? Well, having written 2 piano suites based on Millet's paintings, Ophelia and a Huguenot, which you may know, they were both realized in Malden, close to where I live in southwest London. I thought it was time to turn to the work of Holman Hunt, Millet's pre-Raphaelite friend and lodging companion at Worcester Park Farm, when they were both working on this picture in roughly 1851. Hunt began work on his iconic painting, The Light of the World, at the same time, and its background landscape similarly draws on scenes close to the Hogsmill River in Surrey. This piece received its premiere in Tokyo, and by remarkable coincidence, after we got on the JL airplane to fly to Tokyo, we opened the complimentary copy of Nikkei Shimbun, the newspaper, and would you know it, The Light of the World was their featured painting for that day or that week. They were doing a series on Western painting, so we thought that was quite a remarkable coincidence. There are 2 versions of this painting which are well known. There are actually 3, but 2 which are particularly well known. The original, which is hanging in Keble College, Oxford, when it first went up, Holman Hunt was a little bit anxious that it wasn't getting the attention that it deserved, and it did get into quite a bad state of repair. So as a result, he painted his second one, which is a much larger image. The original is only about that size. The second one is huge. And that's the one that you may have seen in St. Paul's Cathedral and is probably the more familiar image. Now, Millet and Holman Hunt had rather different characters. Millet was straightforward, open, honest, and pragmatic. Some would say naive. By contrast, Hunt was complex, troubled, idealistic, and inconsistent. He wrestled with the subject matter of his paintings, which are often full of cryptic symbolism, and this is no exception. In The Light of the World, the pre-Raphaelite ideal of realistic representation is compromised by the startling representation of Christ with a halo and dressed in somewhat bizarre robes and headgear. But the background scenery was painted from life, in the middle of the night, so that Hunt could capture the special quality of the pre-dawn moonlit landscape to perfection. This was, according to the experts, unprecedented in the history of English painting. Commonplace to us now, but startling in its time. I've attempted to capture some of the mystical, otherworldly qualities of half-light and shifting, shadow-laden atmosphere in the music. The painting is based on a verse from the book of Revelation in the Bible. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and sup with him and he with me. I guess it's a very familiar verse to most of us here. Revelation is probably the most controversial book in the Bible. Its complex symbolism invites wildly differing interpretations, fought over and vehemently defended by their devotees. There are 3 main interpretations of Hunt's treatment of this verse. First of all, I'll just show you this version in Japanese, since it was first performed in Japanese, and I know we have a number of Japanese speakers here, so I hope you appreciate the Japanese version to go alongside the English one. There are 3 interpretations of this verse from Revelation. The first is that Christ is knocking at the heart's door of an individual who as yet knows nothing of him. There's no handle on the outside. The individual must respond, open the door, and invite Christ to come in and fill the yearning gap inside. This interpretation tends to be favoured by evangelical Christians. The context of the original scripture quotation is a letter to a young Christian church to people who already know Christ, but have effectively shut him out of their lives by ignoring him. By welcoming him back in, their lives will be enriched and their faith invigorated. Thirdly, it can be seen as a message to humankind in general, clearly something that Holman Hunt himself had in mind. It represents a challenge to obstinate, closed minds that attempt to organize their own and other people's lives according to corrupt human values, i.e. physical power, aggression, envy, retribution, but instead inviting them to adopt the higher spiritual values of peace, compassion, love, and sacrifice as represented in the person of Christ. So my first piece, I've broken the picture down into various components. The door, the face of Christ, the lantern, the weeds, the trees in the background, and what you may not realize is a little bat up in the corner there, which gets a movement to itself. But I start off with the door that Christ is knocking on. Hunt's original working title was Christ at the Door, and the door is clearly the starting point of the painting. It was, in fact, the door of a disused gunpowder store. The Hogsmill River was for centuries the site of a series of gunpowder mills powered by running water, which provided the principal source of ammunition for England's armies worldwide from the time of Henry VIII onwards. When I first heard about the powder mills on the Hogsmill, I was a bit puzzled, and I was thinking, was it talcum powder? Snuff, as there are snuff mills on the Wandle River, I believe, but no, it was gunpowder. And a little aside, not quite relevant to Holman Hunt, but perhaps it is, as we'll see. When gunpowder was first discovered in China, the Chinese thought, wow, this makes beautiful fireworks, or as they call them in China and Japan, fire flowers or smoke flowers that light up the sky and provide joy and happiness to us. The Westerners arrived in China, looked at this remarkable substance. Their first thought was, oh, silly Chinese, we can use this to kill people. And that's what they brought back to putting their guns in the West. And that's one reason why I feel a rather more benign sense towards some of our Chinese friends and the Far East than perhaps many folk in the West do. In his memoirs, Holman Hunt remembered how, whilst painting in the moonlit orchard, quoting, "The noises of life ceased save the draggling pulsation of the powder mill down in the vale below, whose measured beating timed the black night. It was a dangerous business. Powder stores are prone to blow up with devastatingly fatal consequences. And indeed, following a series of catastrophic explosions, the Hogsmill works were all closed and abandoned a few years later in the 1860s. Working from Hunt's memoirs and old maps, I located the ruined foundations of a hut that Holman Hunt, I think, probably used, much overgrown, with piles of scattered bricks nearby, still charred from an explosion. The site, with its dark, brooding trees, silted up sluice channels, and dense undergrowth, as we find in the background of Hunt's painting, the site still veritably drips with atmosphere. And this is a map of where he would have been. There's where the site of Worcester Park Farm, which has all been knocked down and developed into housing now. Here's the site of the orchard in which he would have been painting, as we will see, and there's still an apple tree there that I think may well have been preserved over the centuries, over the decades, because it was Hunt's apple tree. And then down here, there's the Hogsmill River, and here is where the site of the old powder mills were, with some of the brickwork still, where it can still be seen. So my music uses a form of note encoding to turn the words, "Behold, I stand at the door," into a melody and a matching series of harmonies. And that serves as a little recurring pattern throughout the piece. Those of you who are musical experts will know that's something the French composer Messiaen did, and it's something I've often done in my music. But Christ's patient words are met with obstinate rejection. The door repeatedly slams shut. The mechanical pounding of the mills that rung in Hunt's ear is featured in the piano piece that gradually builds up into an explosion. And I'll warn you, there is a bit of a surprise at the explosive end. The piece represents or reflects the folly of those whose misplaced trust in human power effectively cocoons them inside a ticking time bomb. Beguiled by this false security, self-assured behind their heart's door, they remain trapped as long as they continue to reject the patient entreaties of the Prince of Peace. So I hope that didn't upset the audio too much. The second piece is The Knock. The Light of the World inspired a number of 19th century poets and hymn writers, something I wished to recognize. In this piece, I quote from the hymn Knocking, written by the famous American author Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the influential book Uncle Tom's Cabin and was a leading light in the US anti-slavery movement. She lived with her husband, a professor at Bowdoin College in the United States, state of Maine, and that's a place I was privileged to visit a few years ago when I was having a piece performed in nearby Portland, Maine. It was a very cold and frosty day and had to trample through the snow to get there. The name of the late American experimental composer John Cage suggests entrapment and a consequential implied longing for liberation. Cage's influence can be heard in this piece, where I also make use of the Morse code version for the word open, turned into a knocking rhythm. Third piece is called The Bat. Hunt's bat is barely noticeable in the top left-hand corner of the image. You'll have to look very closely to try and find it. It's a bit too dark for us to, see it, but that's it. Can you see the outline? Just about. Just in the top corner there. It's a curious inclusion, perhaps a private joke shared with Millet. Millet's painting Ophelia originally featured a water rat that Millet subsequently painted out of his final version. Perhaps Millet and Hunt had a joint pact to include a small furry creature in their respective paintings. Hunt did explain that the bat, a creature of the night and a symbol of ignorance, represented man's soul in darkness. There's another curious bat episode dating from Hunt's student days that I discovered reading his memoirs and diaries. Whilst working on the painting Christ and the Two Marys, in his search for authentic Middle Eastern foliage that we have here, Hunt went to paint in the palm house at Kew Gardens. He was offered a discarded palm branch to take back to the studio with his assistant. Whilst carrying it down the street, I can just imagine the scene slung between their shoulders, Hunt felt a small furry object plop down the back of his neck. It was a dead bat. Perhaps he took it back to his studio and it served as the model for the light of the world. So I have cast this movement as something of a light-hearted interlude. Those of you who are familiar with my work may know that I like some serious bits, some light-hearted bits, some more mathematical, scientific bits, some more lyrical bits, some more spiritual bits. So there's a lot of variety, and this is the light-hearted musical interlude. My musical bat darts around the keyboard to a familiar operatic quotation, which I hope some of you will recognize, falling out of the foliage at the end. The next movement is, the next three movements all represent the weeds in the picture, which Hunt described as, see if I can find one with just the weeds in it. Here are the weeds all growing up the side of the door. We've got ivy, brambles, and cow parsley. So the first weed that I consider is ivy. I'm sorry that this image isn't very clear, but there's the ivy going right up to the top of the door. Hunt described his weeds as the cumber of daily neglect, the accumulated hindrances of sloth. Ivy will quickly smother and choke out the light of its chosen host unless it is ruthlessly pruned back and controlled. The Latin name of ivy, Hedera helix, reflects the helical or twisting pattern of its growth. I've tried to imitate this as a musical figure, growing vertically up at first and then bushing out into a dense, choking mass. I'll talk about the next weed and then play all three pieces together. Brambles follows ivy. Thorny brambles bear the delicious blackberry. It grows in profusion in our garden and close to where we live. Picking the fruit can be painful and hazardous. The plant is fast-growing and invasive, rapidly taking over unless mercilessly pulled out and destroyed. It's an ideal metaphor for the encumbrance of seductive distractions and bad habits. A relevant story in Holman Hunt's memoirs relates how while staying at Worcester Park Farm, actually I think they're Millet's memoirs rather than Holman Hunt's, while staying at Worcester Park Farm, a lesser-known member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, Charlie Collins, joined them for dinner. He refused a helping of blackberry tart on the grounds that it was too decadent, a distractive temptation. He was quite an ascetic figure. As Millet playfully teased Collins about his excessive asceticism, Hunt sat nearby sketching his first ideas for the light of the world. Later that evening, he strolled out into the moonlit orchard to begin his painting. So in this movement, I aim to make the music decadent and indulgent, cool dinner jazz style, representing the temptation of sensual but dangerous pleasures that detract from the light of the spirit. The third of the weeds is cow parsley, also known as wild chervil. It grows in profusion along the roadsides and hedgerows of rural Surrey, and Hunt's painting shows its late autumn or winter appearance. The dead seed heads have a distinctive symmetrical umbelliferous shape, rather like the 7 branches of a Jewish candlestick or menorah, which I have turned into symmetric 7-note melody patterns, going from one note like that. Holman Hunt's celebrated pre-Raphaelite colleague, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, was also a poet of distinction. His poem, very well-known poem, Silent Noon, contains the lines, "Where the cow parsley skirts the hawthorn hedge, 'tis visible silence, still as the hourglass." The thin stems of parsley, cow parsley, can easily be broken by passers-by or a strong wind, so that a seed head topples over to hang upside down. When juxtaposed next to an unbroken stem, this forms the shape of an hourglass, as we can see here. I extended to the musical note pattern to imitate this hourglass shape, a contracting, then inverted, expanding figure. Like that. The herb chervil is linked with myrrh, a symbol of sacrifice. Chervil soup was traditionally served on Maundy Thursday as part of the Christian celebration of Holy Week, leading up to Easter. Myrrh was, of course, also one of the gifts of the Magi, or the wise men, who attended Jesus at his birth, who traditionally rode on camels. Hence, I've superimposed the hourglass-shaped melody onto an ambling camel rhythm. So we start with the spiraling ivy, followed by the sensuous brambles, and finally the cow parsley as a symbol of sacrifice. Next, we come to a movement which I've called the countenance. Commentators have noted that the face of Christ in this picture has a rather feminine quality, with a beard added, of course. Indeed, it was a woman, Christina Rossetti, who initially modelled for the face at Hunt's studio in London. Sister of the painter Rossetti, she was briefly engaged to Charlie Collins, he of the Blackberry Tart. Christina Rossetti was an accomplished poet herself, author of the words to a much-loved carol. A few years ago, I set these words for choir, and it seemed particularly appropriate to reuse the music here in this new context, arranged as a piano piece. This setting for choir was one of the first things I did with the choir when I first came to one of the first things I did with the choir when I first came to St. Paul's about 11 or 12 years ago was a setting of this carol, which I'm now doing in a piano version. William Blake's celebrated poem Jerusalem envisages Christ walking in the English landscape. Blake had quite an influence on the pre-Raphaelite painters. When he originally talked about the dark satanic mills in Jerusalem, the mills that we often associate with that, the cotton mills and the textile mills in the north, were not built. Almost certainly the mills that Blake was referring to were the powder mills, the dark satanic mills that produced the gunpowder to kill Britain's enemies and expand the empire. So that's, again, a particularly appropriate link between Blake's Jerusalem and Hunt's painting. So I'm speculating that Holman Hunt might have had that imagery in mind as he painted adjacent to these dark satanic mills. So I used Blake's term, the countenance divine, as a title for this movement. notice that that piece finishes with the first three notes of the hymn, Love Divine. The next piece is the Crown of Thorns. A core pre-Raphaelite principle was to paint scenes as realistically as possible. Hunt's door, weeds, and moonlit scene are authentic and believable, but to introduce such an extraordinarily attired human figure seems to be rather at odds with this principle. Whilst irritatingly inconsistent, this anomaly is also part of the painting's charm. The crown of thorns, familiar from traditional Christian iconography, identifies the figure as Christ, the suffering servant, offering redemption through his own sacrifice. But Hunt's crown of thorns is different. It sprouts flowers, suggesting beauty emerging from pain. It also gives the figure a curiously English pagan appearance, celebrating nature and life's renewal. Musically, I have repeatedly cycled a chain of thorny dissonances which gradually soften to sweeter sounds as additional harmonies fill the gaps. Knowing that we have one or two music theory experts here, I just mentioned the major seventh interval sounds very thorny and dissonant. When you stick a couple of extra notes in the middle, it softens it. So there are the thorns, there are the flowers. Hunt has actually painted two crowns here. This is the crown, incidentally, in the St. Paul's version. Not quite so clear in this picture. But in both paintings, here it's more clear that Hunt has painted two crowns, which is following a reference to a number of crowns in Revelation chapter 19. I thought it was appropriate to quote from the popular Victorian hymn, Crown Him with Many Crowns, which was penned in 1851, exactly the same time as the painting was produced and exhibited. So it's quite possible that the hymn was influenced by Hunt's picture, or possibly the other way around. Next, we come to the clasp or breastplate. That's a close-up. If I go back to the original. There, we can see the breastplate, which is more prominent in this version. There, it's a little dark, the reproduction. So that's a close-up. The clasp on the robe is enlarged to such a size in the original painting that it takes on the appearance of a breastplate, another startling anomaly in the picture. But it provides a symbol of Christ's priesthood or intermediary role between God and man. In the Bible, the high priest's breastplate of the Old Testament contained 12 precious stones, a symbolic number, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 related gemstones also occur at the end of the Bible in the book of Revelation, symbolic of the spiritual New Jerusalem. Hunt researched his gemstones carefully. Musically, I've tried to capture the idea of sparkling tones and colours, shifting and glittering in the flickering shadows and half-light. So I actually did this quite mathematically, tracing different patterns between 12 notes, musical notes, and tracing a little pattern, a different one for each gemstone. The composer Schoenberg was particularly captivated with matching biblical and musical symbolism of the number 12, so that's an approach which I have emulated here. Each gemstone uses all 12 pitches of the chromatic scale. The high priest's breastplate also contained objects known as the Urim and Thummim. Somewhat mysterious, but they were used for decision-making and to discern God's will. I thought that they operated as a form of divination, rather like tossing a coin. Hence, I tossed a coin, a 1 yen piece, as it happened. In typical fashion with many composers, I was still working on some details of this piece after I arrived in Japan. So I tossed a coin to determine note rhythms and textures. Very Cajun thing to do. Hunt introduced a further level of symbolism matching the rectangular biblical breastplate on the right with a circular breastplate, totally inauthentic, circular breastplate to the left containing 13 gemstones which were to represent the heathen priesthood of the Gentiles or non-Jews. A clearly inclusive gesture on Hunt's part. They are joined together by a clasp containing gems in the shape of a crucifix. The music for the circular shape takes the form of a turning spiral, whilst that of the rectangular shape is more angular. And again, that's something I've tried to imitate in the music. We begin with the circular breastplate and gemstones, and then move on to the rectangular one, and then back to the circular one. They are linked by chords in the shape of a cross. missed out the reprise of the circular one because we are running a little bit out of time. 10th piece is the lantern. The lantern was very important to Holman Hunt. It was a central feature of his painting as a symbol of light to the nations, hence light of the world. A lantern was specially constructed to his detailed specifications. It served as a model and helped Hunt to explore how the light would dissipate and cast shadows through its distinctive openings. It had 7 sides, another significant number both biblically and musically. The biblical verse on which the painting is based, Revelation 3:20, forms part of a series of 7 letters sent to what were known as the 7 churches of Asia. I have taken this to be the source of Hunt's symbolic number, where each side of the lantern represents one of the 7 churches. Hence, this movement is cast as a set of 7 variations, one for each church, and each on a different degree of the diatonic scale, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There are 2 popular versions of the Light of the World. Hunt's original, based at Keble College, Oxford University. The larger copy, made some 50 years later at St. Paul's Cathedral, compared to the original, this later copy contains a subtle but significant change to the lantern, where Hunt has inserted a crescent moon to join the stars and circles as an additional opening at the side. I'm not sure if we can actually see it on this painting, but there's a crescent just at the side there. In his lifetime, Hunt travelled widely in the Middle East and grew to admire and celebrate the peoples and cultures he encountered there. This tiny but deliberate gesture seems to support a broader creed that Hunt had adopted by this time, that light can be seen to shine from many faiths, fellow travellers rather than competitors to Christianity. So I sought an existing melody for my variations that had a universal resonance. The one I've used here, known as Katibim in Turkey, is familiar and popular across the Middle East and the Balkans, sung to different words by Muslims, Jews, and Christians alike. And I have to thank 2 members of St. Paul's congregation, Bob and Anne, for introducing this tune to me when I was asked to write some music for friends of theirs, a Catholic gentleman marrying a Muslim girl. So it was a very nice piece of music to represent the union of these 2 faiths in their marriage. But each nation claims it as its own, sometimes quite vigorously. Some have even suggested that the music is Scottish in origin, but that sounds a bit far-fetched to me. I present the melody in 7 different guises, moulded to match something of the character of each of the 7 churches as portrayed in Revelation. The location of one of the churches, Smyrna, is the subject of a piano piece by the English composer Elgar, who visited and was smitten with the place. For this variation, I have imitated the style and texture of Elgar's piece called Smyrna. The wording used in association with another church, Thyatira, corresponds to one of the texts set by Handel in the Messiah. For that variation, I've similarly imitated Handel's style and musical texture. Each variation is separated by a short musical motive that represents the turning of the lantern, a musical pattern derived from the 7 stars referenced in Revelation and Hunt's painting. provides very relevant atmosphere, having the candles flickering at the side, because of course Holman Hunt's lantern would have had a candle in it. The last but one piece, in number 11, is the orchard. An apple orchard features in the background of the painting. Hunt described it as a garden of delectable fruit for the dainty feast of the soul, but its care has been neglected by the sluggard skulking behind the door. Sluggard, almost certainly a reference to a very popular poem at the time, How Doth the Sluggard, lampooned by Lewis Carroll, but originally written by the playwright, the hymn writer, whose name escapes me, but I'm sure somebody might know that. Apple orchards were revered in traditional English folklore. Songs known as wassails were sung and danced around the time of the new year to honour the trees, encouraging them to fruit and give them their bounty. And many of these songs have found their way into our Christmas carol repertoire. Originally pagan, the ceremonies, as with many other customs, became incorporated into Christmas celebrations, asking God's blessing on the trees. Wassailing customs survive in parts of England still, and it is quite likely that wassailing songs and dances may have taken place in Hunt's orchard close to the time at which he was painting. Some folk traditions portray Christ himself as an apple tree. In Hunt's painting, the rising curve and the branch off to the right symmetrically matches the arms of Christ, lifted up to knock at the door. As you can see here. And apple trees have this very distinctive shape, which is possibly why they've been associated with Jesus Christ, the apple tree, in in folk culture. Some folk traditions portray Christ himself as an apple tree. Sorry, I've messed up my notes here, but there's another painting by Holman Hunt, Christ in the Carpenter's Workshop, where you see the hands of Christ form this particular distinctive shape, which you can see echoed in the shape of Christ as he knocks at the door. And it's a bit hard to see in this version, but this apple tree here has that curve going up. So it's almost like the symmetrical shape of the two arms of Christ that match the shape of the arms in the shadow in that painting. So in this piece, it takes the form of a lively dance around the trees in country style, celebrating God's providence and bounty. I've copied that shape in a rising melodic figure, which is large intervals, which then become smaller intervals as they approach the opposite way around, small intervals, followed by a large interval going up with the sweep of the arms at the end. And then we come to the final piece, the promise. The second half of the biblical quotation on which the painting is based contains the promise, "If any man hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and sup with him and he with me." So the music for the final movement echoes these words. The soul hears what Hunt describes as the music of the still, small voice, the summons to the sluggard to awaken and open the door. So in the music, the door opens, Christ steps over the threshold, and they enjoy communion together. Not a laying down of the law, not condemnation or coercive preaching, but questions and answers shared. An intimate dialogue over a shared meal where Christ provides companionship and thoughtful counsel. apologies, I've gone on for a bit longer than perhaps you were expecting, but hope you'll forgive me.
So we'll move to Q&A. No, shall I just explain?
Yes, okay.
How we'll move forward. We'll now, in order to accommodate those at home who are watching, we'll just take a couple of minutes to switch over onto Zoom. So we'll have some more faces, hopefully, up on the screen here of people who are going to be interacting with Kevin, as well as you who might have questions. So we'll have just a brief pause, and then we'll move to question and answers with Kevin. Okay, thank you.